Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here today. It's good to see everybody. My name is Sasha. I'm an employee at the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. I just wanted to welcome everyone to the webinar today. Um, we want to give you just a brief introduction for those who might be new to the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Um, Up on your screen, you can see our mission. I'll just read it as well. The U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, USFWC, we also just call it the Federation sometimes if you're in the know, is the national grassroots membership organization for worker cooperatives and democratic workplaces. Our mission is to build a thriving ecosystem for worker-owned and controlled businesses and cooperative leaders in order to power movements for racial justice and economic democracy. So that's the big picture. For a little bit more about what that looks like in practice, some of the things we do involve identifying challenges and looking for solutions to different trends we see emerging in the solidarity economy ecosystem. We also look to identify expertise and needs inside and outside of the ecosystem. And we are always learning together. And then we want to really amplify and share the lessons that other folks have learned so that we're all learning from each other. And that's also part of connecting our community to the resources that they need and creating the spaces for exploring new ideas together. So that's how we see ourselves in some of what we do. Like I said, we're really glad to have you today. Let me give you a brief picture of the agenda. We're going to be doing welcoming and introductions. We're in that part now. And then we have two amazing presenters today that will be going over what are social co-ops and considerations for designing social co-ops. Then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And that's going to take us through. We invite you now to introduce yourself in the chat if you're able to. If you're interested in doing so, you could put your name, if you're from an organization or a cooperative, what is the name of that, and where you're joining us from so that folks can get a sense of who's here. Feel free to put that in the chat as we go on. Now I'm going to turn it over to our executive director, Esteban Kelly, to tell you a little bit more about what we're here for today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sasha. Um, Sasha just joined our team last year and has been really supporting the expansion of a lot of our membership programs and a lot of the work and organizing we do with our peer networks and our grassroots member councils. And I see people who are involved in some of those spaces here today. So it's good to see you all. Thanks so much, Sasha. My name's Esteban. I use he and him. I'm the executive director for the Worker Co-op Federation, and I've been doing that since 2015. I'm really excited to welcome and introduce our two presenters today. Like Sasha said, we'll have an opportunity to field some questions and then all kind of be in dialogue together. And then we're thinking that this will lead into a part two, probably this summer, that's going to be structured in a more of a kind of roundtable. So folks who really are studying up or practitioners in either developing or being involved in or researching or working at social co-ops of various kinds or things that might become or be recategorized as social co-ops, being in dialogue together. So that's where this is all heading. And it's good to see some of you already here today. So our two guests, we have Minsun, who is the executive director of the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, which promotes employee ownership through co-op conversion, co-op incubation research, and policy. Minsun's a labor and community organizer, activist scholar, and popular educator. Minsun's also been doing work with the Drivers Co-op and is an active member in our Union Co-ops Council, one of the handful of grassroots member councils with the Worker Co-op Federation. We're also joined today by Jerome Hughes, who's an assistant professor of law at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clarke School of Law, and directs the Community Development Law Clinic. UDC's Community Development Law Clinic represents cooperatives, nonprofit organizations, and urban entrepreneurs on matters related to entity formation, which we'll talk about and hear about, and also financing, contract, and governance. Jerome has practiced in various settings related to affordable housing and community development. So we're going to hear from each of them for about 15 minutes. Yes, I will update the times here. And I'm going to pass it to you to go to share first, Minsun.
Yep, thank you. 7. Okay, can you see
Yes,
the
we're
slide?
good.
Okay, you're good. You're good. Okay, so from beginning. Okay. So hi everybody, my name is Minsun. I'm with the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. Super excited to share this presentation. Originally, actually, this presentation happened at a conference. So I want to kind of share what we have thought of. Quickly, just RMUC. I'm with RMUC. We do EL convergence and incubation and co-op education and research and policy. And all of this sort of the social cooperative idea actually came from while I was working at the RMUC. I find a lot of challenges and keep thinking about how we can actually do a little bit better. That was a kind of a motivation around this idea. So, okay, so what are the social cooperatives? I'm going to actually talk about what are social cooperatives, giving a little bit examples of other countries, but then actually my focus is what's happening right here in the United States, because my argument is very simple. We are ready to create a new social cooperative. So I'm going to tell you why. So that is my piece. And then Jerome will talk about different models. Let's see. It's not moving. Okay. So what are social cooperatives? Social cooperatives have actually a few important characteristics. Number one, cooperatives actually have to advance the public interest. That is a kind of coming with a social mission, such as serving a marginalized community. That is really important characteristic of what is a social cooperative. So let's say I'm working with different areas and I'm not actually working with or serving a marginalized community. Perhaps your cooperative may not belong to these social cooperatives, right? So there are a couple of important characteristics. Number one, serving the public interest. That means that actually your membership goal should go beyond benefiting the members. So that can be actually related to our important co-op principle, which is concern for others. So when we talk about cooperatives such as the people dealing with disabilities or low-wage workers or previously incarcerated peoples, and if you are forming those cooperatives, perhaps you are part of that social cooperative because you serve the public interest much bigger common good, but at the same time, you are also creating the job for those marginalized communities. So with that job creation and kind of serving the public interests, social cooperatives are everywhere. Actually, in Italy, there are about 11,000 social cooperatives, and out of 11,700 are in Emilia-Romagna, which is very well known for social economic sectors. And if you look at South Korea, they actually passed a new law in 2012 to support job creation for marginalized community. As a result, they have about 3,600 social cooperative as well. It's not just Italy and South Korea, and it's Quebec, and there are many different countries, as you can see. But each country is different, right? Some country will allow the distribution, some country don't. For example, South Korea actually surplus distribution is not allowed, along with the France and Spain and Catalonia. So each model can be different. However, the commonality, as I said, is all of these social cooperatives deal with the poor folks and marginalized communities. And if your members are coming from those marginalized communities, perhaps you are part of that social cooperatives. So I was thinking about how about here in the United States, right? Because these social cooperative in different countries get tax benefit. They get a preferential procurement from the government, so that whenever any kind of a contract comes, it always go to social cooperatives first. Tax credit, and also they have a stable wages and income for the marginalized community because members are coming from them, right? So there are a lot of benefit associated with the social cooperatives. So the question is, how about here in the United States, right? Do we have a lot of cooperatives that serve the marginalized communities? My answer is actually yes. And I think this is a super, super exciting moment for us, because if you really look at the co-op development history in the United States, right? Before the crisis, in 2008, a lot of sort of the co-op development happened in agriculture and housing cooperative. We have a few, hundreds of worker co-ops, but it wasn't that much. It was really led by university co-op development centers in the 1960s and 70s. But after the crisis in 2008, it completely changed, right? We have more worker co-ops. As of 2021, we have over 612 and hundreds are on the way. And how about the rise of worker centers? Worker center became critical in organizing very informal and platform workers. And now there are hundreds of the worker center working with the day laborers, domestic workers, and very temporary informal workers. With that connections, I think there are a lot of innovation happening between worker centers and worker co-op as well. Miami centers, it just start organizing a drivers co-op as well. So, and then over time, there are so many co-op development organizations. Perhaps in the beginning of 2000s, there are only a handful. But right now, there are so many employee ownership centers in so many states. This is great because, again, we see co-op development as economic development strategies, right, for the marginalized communities. I'm going to only share a few innovative co-op incubation organizations here, but there are so many more, right? So some of the things that we are thinking about is how we're going to actually scale up our co-op movement, right? So some of the co-op developers who provide TA start also organizing, start incubating cooperatives. ICA Group is very, very well-known co-op development organizations since 1970s. And, they have a child care co-ops, and their really key thing is actually home care cooperatives. They have a 16 actually home care cooperatives in 9 states. And they are actually trying to create a national headquarters so that, more child care or home care co-ops can be under the assistance of the ICA groups, right? And then Prospera, which used to be the wages in the past, are the one also organizing cleaning co-ops in the 1990s. Do you remember? They were focusing on one industry, which was cleaning, and they grew rapidly to form 6 cleaning co-ops with hundreds of the workers. Simple Family Life is very, very well known, as you know, that, starting in 2006 with a cleaning co-op. Now they organize 21 co-ops with, platform co-op, which is up and go. And now thinking of expanding our social franchising cleaning cooperative through Bradley. And they are also launching many different cooperatives. And Sustainable Economy Law Center in their early time also incubate some of the co-ops. How about RMUC? This is my organizations, and we started organizing the Drives Co-op since 2022, and finally we are actually launching the co-op this year. So think about those 2 years. What would these organizations do? Fundraising, organizing, co-op education, and launch. It's a lot of times, right? And Co-op Cincy is very, very well-known organizations founded in 2011. They are very unique because they also have a unionized worker co-op as well. And they are actually helping 16 co-ops to be incubated. So why will we actually incubate co-ops in the United States? And one of the reasons that actually our co-op movement grew so fast from hundreds to 612 right now is because we want to do a little more active work, right? So within the nonprofit organization, within the co-op nonprofit organizations, we are trying to raise capital for those cooperatives. Otherwise, it's very difficult for those cooperatives to be launched. For example, Drives Co-op is one example, right? Because we just, it took us 2 years to raise $500,000. And finally, we are launching it, right? So that raising capital is so critical. And they also not just supporting just for 1 year. Actually, a lot of incubating organizations have a couple of years to make sure that the co-op become more sustainable, right? Number two, why do we actually incubate co-ops? Because we are thinking about scaling up the movements by using this social franchising, right? It's not only used by a McDonald's and all other kind of commercial franchise. We could also use that too, right? So by looking at Europe, Europe already had developed so many social franchising, but we can do the same thing here in the United States. And then thirdly, we want to also focus on advocacy and policy. When we are growing our core movements, then we can actually do more of a policy, right? And all of these sort of three things goes together. But when I was doing it, actually, in the case of a Drives Co-op, I faced actually a lot of obstacles. Number one, I think I get a lot of questions about, so, what can you do and what you cannot do, right? Because again, a lot of groups from the marginalized community come to us and say, hey, should we create a nonprofit or should we create a cooperative? Why? Because if they actually create a nonprofit, they can actually raise some funding from grant. But I think there are a lot of sort of the obstacles around what we should be doing, right? In terms of helping to raise capitals. And then also another obstacle is that, how much actually earning business incomes that can we do? Obviously, there are many different theory as to 5 to 10% cap for unrelated business income for the nonprofit supporting to incubate the co-op. And some people said, it can go up to a 15 to 30%. But whatever that is, we always have to be very, very careful, right? We have a lot of ideas to incubate the different co-ops, but always we face these problems of what is the limitations and governance conflict as well. Again, what kind of powers actually the nonprofit can exert over its incubated cooperative. Obviously, our job is to help develop the leadership, but again, there are some sort of the confusion over governance conflict as well. Well, so what we do, I guess the big thing for us is that United States is actually ready. I think, right now, this is the time for us to actually create a social cooperative because, again, there are very, very innovation happening within the cooperatives and co-op development organizations. And, for a lot of marginalized communities, it's really important for them to get more tax benefit and more support, like Europe and some Asian countries. So how can we also support the social cooperative in the United States? We are trying to think about, right, what will that look like here? We can also give them some sort of a preferential procurement as well, so that whenever there's any government contract, they get that first. As you know, we need a market, and government plays a really important market, and they are the one who can actually provide a market for a lot of emerging social cooperatives as well. And on why also we can actually support the social cooperative, because we want to scale up, because we believe that in social cooperatives and cooperative movement in general is really good, right? If there are more benefit coming, that is when we can really scale up all of our social economy movements. So I want to kind of finish up by saying why we are actually doing it here in the United States. Me being a practitioner, I think that it's a time for us to do it. My argument is very simple. Other countries are doing it, and we have built a very strong infrastructures over time. And we have amazing, U.S. Federation Workers Co-op and a lot of regional and national cooperative organizations and local organizations, really working hard to help form the cooperatives for the marginalized community. So it's a time for us to do it. And we just need to create a new social cooperative terminology, right? We don't have that terminology here in the United States. but why not? I think that is a kind of a why I'm here. And another reason that why we actually have to do it is about equity. We need to actually create a better social equity. If actually every distributions happen at the same levels, regardless of their circumstance or income levels, always the gap exists, right? There is no way to actually narrow the gap. But if we want to actually pour more resources to the marginalized communities and social cooperative that serves the marginalized communities, then that's when actually we could really create a social equity. So I think that it's a right time for us to think about how we can actually bring this concept to the United States. And my bottom line is, let's do this. Thank you.
Amazing and perfect timing. Thank you, Minsun. We're going to pass now to Professor Hughes. Jerome, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Great.
I'm gonna play. Let's see. Here we go. So good afternoon. Thanks, everyone. I'm Jerome Hughes again, he, him, his. So I want to chat about the possibility of Section 501c3 social cooperatives. This presentation extended out of some research I did for a paper. And generally, I want to talk about a few areas. One, let me make sure I start my time. What are social cooperatives? Two, whether social cooperatives would qualify under 501c3 status. Three, to think about how we can certify social cooperatives, and then think a bit about the values and uses for social cooperatives. So, we all have some definition that we have for cooperatives more generally, right? Involving democracy, one person, one vote, involving sort of labor control over sort of the means of production, involving the ICA principle. So all of us sort of come with some definitions. But then there's this question of what are we talking about when we sort of speak to social? Are we talking about the charitable purposes? Are we talking about relief of poverty? Are we talking about specific entity and legal features? And that's sort of where I enter this discussion. So in our practice, we had a child care cooperative who, of course, gave us permission to talk about them, of low-income women of color who were very interested in creating a child care cooperative. And they were keen that there was this sort of, extended period of development that would need to occur, before the entity was up and running. All of them were, working full time. And so one of the things that they came up with, they're like, hey, we want to create an adjoining nonprofit, as we're creating this cooperative. Because they realized they needed to get grants and supports in order to support this venture. And that's something I see often, with a number of small businesses that come into our clinic. They want to not only create the business, but also create this sort of adjoining nonprofit that might provide support. And so that got me thinking about, like, how do we sort of think about these categories not as sort of two separate categories, but together. In addition, a number of social entrepreneurs come into our clinic, wanting to create jobs for low-income workers. And often they have this thought, okay, if I create this nonprofit, then there's these things that I will be able to do in terms of supporting low-income workers or providing services. And so again, there's this question is like, could we sort of bring these ideas in under the same basket? So that's sort of where the question for me around social cooperatives emerged from. And there's kind of three ways that I thought about this question of what are social cooperatives. You can think about it as sort of at a discourse level, like we because many times when we talk about cooperatives, we talk about all the sort of public interest values that emanate from them, including democracy, including equality, including providing for the needs of its members and the community. So we're all already talk about cooperatives in the way that we could think about. The second way I thought about social cooperatives is, if we provide a specific definition and then create a certification system related to it. And then the third way is around sort of some sort of legislation or policy, right? So for me, it was around this 501c3 status. A number of states already have legislation that sort of goes in this direction. And so I wanted to sort of ask this question of, can we make social cooperatives, as 501c3 entities? And sort of researching that question took me back to the question around definition and certification system. So again, as we talk about social cooperatives, I'm thinking about worker cooperatives, I'm thinking about affordable housing cooperatives, I'm thinking about consumer and purchasing cooperative, multi-stakeholder cooperatives, sort of fitting into that category. And, of course, as Minsun sort of noted, sort of in the Italian context, there's over, 21,000 social cooperative that, starting from 1991 until today, employing over 480,000 people. In the US, we already have this very sort of robust community around housing cooperative, limited equity housing cooperatives, group equity housing cooperatives, and community land trust. And many of those are in the group equity and community land trust community are nonprofits. As Minsun noted, there's this sort of really robust nonprofit community that supports the sort of cooperative ecosystem. And importantly, I just want to also identify that ESOPs as tax exempt organizations, a lot of people don't think of them, but they actually fall under sort of the same sort of section of the code that 501c3 would fall under. And so I'll highlight that more later. So in thinking about social cooperatives, I want to sort of propose to you so that, so you're thinking about this as I sort of go through a number of steps. I would suggest that, when we think about sort of what sort of participants are in social cooperatives, that they're sort of, 75% of those people fall into the sort of poverty and disadvantage. And that number comes from a particular revenue procedure that comes out of the housing, so for something that we've done for housing. And so I pulled it over into what we do, what we're sort of thinking about for social cooperatives. So my basic framework is like, thinking about the poverty disadvantage status of the participants. I've started to think more in talking with Minsun among others, whether it could be 50% plus some strong charitable purpose. Two, thinking about sort of how the capital accounts in the social cooperative sort of function. And I have sort of a specific proposal around that. And then this question around certification and legal status. So those are sort of the four components that I often think about in thinking about social cooperatives. Again, I start from this question of like, what would help us to think about, what would help us to get 501c3 status? So, basic question is whether a social cooperative as defined by these requirements would be eligible under 501c3, which involves two basic questions. Does it meet the sort of exempt purposes test? And then secondly, you want to make sure it doesn't sort of violate any limitations that are put on 501c3 entities, including the non-distribution doctrine, any market limiting doctrines, any sort of policy and political related doctrines. I'm going to only focus on non-distribution doctrines for the course of this presentation. So when we think about the 501c3, it's embedded in 501a. And so here in the top right-hand corner, you could see sort of ESOPs are part of the tax exempt community. And then you have 501c, and there's 28 varieties of 501c organizations, some of those actually including co-ops. And then you have 501c3, which is, I have this like sort of little character over here sort of representing sort of a donor, right? And a donor can donate tax deductible to a 501c3 entity, which makes it unique of the category, right? And so that's why it's the sort of the golden prize of sort of the 501 A organizations. Having a little trouble with the screen. Here we go. So again, we get to our first question. Would it meet the exempt purpose status? So if you actually look at the statute, very dense statute, it has this language: organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, educational, and other purposes, right? And so that sort of spells out what type of purposes sort of qualify. And then it also has this language about no part of the net earnings which inure to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual. And that gets at this non-distribution question. So when we think about exempt purposes, again, it has all of these, 501c3 has all of these exempt purposes. I focus on the exempt purpose of charitable, because under that falls this sort of relief of the poor and distress, which is particularly linked to sort of the class of people that are served by a particular organization, right? And I think that class of people is important. And so this comes, then comes my first sort of argument that a social cooperative should essentially fulfill the exempt and charitable purpose of relief of the poor. Again, starting from this definition that we have no fewer than 75% are poor and disadvantaged populations, and that it provides these various benefits to the poor and disadvantaged. And so the cooperative sector is pretty familiar with these benefits, right? Providing important goods and services to our members, generating employment opportunities, developing human and intellectual capital through work, through governance, through governing these organizations, and all the things that go along with that. And in addition, sort of building basic financial savings all of these are, would be considered part of the benefits to the poor and distressed, and meeting the exempt purpose. So, on its face, we should at least meet the exempt purposes for the social cooperative. So then we get to the sort of harder question around the non-distribution doctrine, which, the language is no part of the net earnings which inure to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual. So essentially this restricts the net earnings of an organization from inuring to the benefit, of these people, of insiders. And so, the first thing that we think, but isn't a social cooperative similar to a traditional firm that, you own the cooperative and so you get the benefits of it? So, I sort of push back on that, right? So if we think about, so how traditional patronage work, we think about sort of here, the net income, right? So revenues minus expenses, we get the net income. And, you may have a 50-50 split. You may have a different split between the individual net income and what we put into the collective net account. And then, the net income, the individual net income account is often is not distributed on the basis of your ownership, as in traditional firms, but on the basis of your usage, right? Whether it's buying goods or whether producing goods or whether sort of working. So all of those different ways this patronage might be distributed, which is not on the basis of ownership. And so that gets to how the nonprofit internal account that I sort of talked about in sort of quadrant 2 would work. Essentially, the collective account would be that nonprofit account in the social cooperative, which would mean you could put donations into that account. It wouldn't pay taxes on that particular part of the account. So that's how how the social cooperative would particularly work, which I think is a pretty important feature, because there's this really important sort of principle of protecting nonprofit assets. And for 501c3 status, that's something that we want to be able to prove, that we are sort of protecting nonprofit assets. And so this gets to my sort of 3 arguments. And so just to go back, so you have the nonprofit internal account on one side, which is not a reserve account. And then on the other side, you have this sort of individual net income, which is what I call limited patronage. And so generally, I argue that limited patronage should not violate private inurements for 3 sort of reasons. One, private inurement doctrine permits a broad range of sort of expenses, including paying wages, bonus, commissions, pensions, a vendor, consultant, or contractor. And the standard for that is that the payments are reasonable and not excessive. And so it would be hard to sort of argue that sort of a limited patronage arrangement based upon time or other uses is nothing but reasonable, right? And so that's sort of my first argument. It falls into the reasonable standard of private inurement. The second is a more sort of technical issue about what patronage is. So patronage is conceived of as a sort of a business expense deduction for goods, purchases, or services provided, and sort of under the price adjustment logic. And under the agent conduit logic, it's considered not even part of the income of the agent, because it's considered as sort of the property of the patron. So for these technical purposes, patronage is not part of the entity's net earning, and so doesn't fall within sort of the restrictions of private inurement. And then for the third reason, and this gets back to the sort of 75% number that I call the supermajority disadvantage principle, the courts have affirmed that tax-exempt organization can actually provide benefits to members of charitable classes. 2 cases worth looking at are industrial aid for the blind versus commissioner, and aid to artisans. And these essentially are sort of cooperative-like nonprofits that sort of distribute part of their net earnings to a charitable class of members on each case. So case law says, hey, if it's going to a charitable class, then private inurement sort of restrictions don't count as much, right? And so I sort of argue that like limited patron arrangements and social impact cooperatives may not violate private inurement. The one thing I would say is that it's one of these issues that it's like right on the boundaries. And so generally when an issue is right on the boundaries, a lawyer is not going to tell you to go and you should do this, sort of operate in this fuzzy sort of space. They probably would tell you probably need to get a private letter ruling. You need to, or see if we can get a revenue ruling or get some sort of change in legislation, because it is in this sort of fuzzy area. So again, this sort of gets at the question of cooperatives. What are the features that we think about? And so I sort of pose these 4 sort of features as sort of a way that we can start to move these social cooperatives into the 501c3 status. And so I moved from 501c3 to what a definition and certification system looks like. So really briefly, I think I have about like 2 minutes here. So how can we certify social cooperatives? So proposed is that, like there's a certified social cooperatives, there's a certifying nonprofit, and there's a national certification board. So what am I doing here? This is in many ways how we're already structured, right? So we already have nonprofit incubators that work, as Minsun noted, with a range of sort of cooperatives providing various support. And the only thing this sort of arrangement adds to is some sort of approach that we sort of create a common certification, right? And so again, the certifying nonprofit provides some sort of various services, incubation, technical assistance, but we sort of add on some sort of cooperating certification board, because and part of this idea is if we're trying to move to this place where these social cooperatives get this special status, then we need to sort of have some definition, some community control definition around what that is. So I want to sort of maybe stop on the next 2 pages. I think of, as we sort of, here I have sort of, a funny picture, but I have like these sort of different stakeholders in the community. I have consumers, I have workers, I have the social entrepreneur, I have philanthropy, and I have policymakers. And they all have to make sort of decisions about who they allocate resources to, and where they put their time and attention. And so the idea of social cooperatives is that it provides a place that we can sort of fulfill social and charitable purposes, that we can reduce poverty, that we can sort of create positive branding for consumer, that we could do some subsidy targeting, and that we can sort of provide legal and policy benefits. And, and because of that, for those reasons, I, along with Minsun, suggest that, it would be great for us to sort of move toward a social cooperative regime. And I will stop there.
Thank you
Wow.
so much to both of our presenters. That was wonderful. I know we've all had a lot to take in and to think about. So as we give you some time to put any questions you may have in the chat, we may have Esteban kick us off with the many questions that he is prepared to prompt us with.
Yeah, I mean, I could take up all the space, and I will not do that. But because there's several elements to it, and I appreciate both of you for offering such a concise and cogent framing. So it's sort of easy to follow, like, what is it we're working with? What's the opportunity here? And it kind of tees up, like, what are some of these considerations for how to move forward and next steps? The first one coming up for me, and maybe I am going to zoom out in terms of the kind of scale of what is it that we're considering, is and some of this might be for the benefit of our international guests today. We have this funny situation in the United States where, because corporate law is addressed and framed up at the state or districts, whatever, DC and overseas territories, Commonwealth, whatever, at that level, there isn't a silver bullet. There isn't any one framework unless you get something that's federally codified, like what happened with the credit union charters, and what's happened with a couple other cooperative models that have gone to scale, like the rural electrics, for example. So generally speaking, especially for worker co-ops, for housing, a lot of the statutes have had to be introduced and adopted or updated on a state-by-state level. And so part of the opportunity here, it goes in both ways. It's double-edged. The positive side of that means that there's so much space for experimentation, right? In the US, like, you could have a single state or a handful of states introduce it, figure it out, test it out, make a compelling case for why social co-ops are useful for all the different ways that each of you framed up. And then that helps to build the case for codifying that and changing or enacting federal laws. On the other hand, it could be such a nightmare off the bat if you have these things that only exist in some states, but not all. And maybe they're incorporated in one state, but they're doing business in other ones, or they're franchising, because of course, more and more business is done in either a virtual or digital or ways that kind of ignore the state boundaries. And so, it does go both ways, because there's ways that sort of inhibits progress, and ways that it creates an opportunity for experimentation. And then part of what I'm hearing from you, Jerome, is that there's an opportunity of going right to the tax code, the federal tax code itself, codifying this thing, and it prevents us from getting bogged down and mired in all the mess of what it would look like to adopt a statute in each of those places. So I'm wondering from each of your perspectives, from both a technical and also a strategic standpoint, what do you see as the opportunities for moving forward? Maybe we'll start with you, Minsun, if you're ready to jump in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. Your question is actually my question too. I think that, we get that, it's really important, but now the question is how, right? How do we make that happen? Because each state is so different. So I guess the big question for me is that if we look at the actually opportunity, I think that there are a lot of confusions, especially among the cooperatives that are interested in supporting other cooperatives to be formed, because we got caught up in this sort of legal battle, right? Because a lot of startup co-op really need capitals, right? This is why we do need a social cooperative, because if we do have them, then it's easier for social cooperative to get funding from grant foundation if actually they are categorized as a nonprofit, right? Because right now it is an incubation organization that is getting the grant and then pass through to the cooperative. That's a lot of thing happening. So for me, my perspective, what legal structures allow our social cooperatives to raise capital easily without going through so many loops, because that is what's happening right now. And it's chaotic, like me having so many different incubation projects and so many foundation, and then now each one goes here and there. It's a really, really nightmare. But how can we make a simple process so that those cooperative will have access to grant funding as a nonprofit or whatever else we want to come up with? So that should be very important when we consider talking about the form of this social cooperative. How can we make it easier for these startup, marginalized community social cooperatives to have access to capital? That's number one that I think we should focus on. Then we can figure out what is the strength and the pro and cons of nonprofit versus other forms. But whatever the format is, I think that our opportunity is to really kind of experiment some, we already have a lot of stories, we have a lot of stories, but I think we should really focus on how we can make that system easier so that the social cooperative get easier access to capital and co-op education, all other stuff. So that would be number one things that I'll take a look at.
It's interesting because and thanks for kind of re-emphasizing that. I'm almost hearing two complementary aspects of this. One from you, Minsun, is around the benefits from the capital side of like actually capturing investment in line with social purpose and philanthropy and all of how that whole ecosystem and framework already functions. And then part of what I'm hearing from Jerome, which complements it, is for the same purposes, what about the tax saving and the tax deferment that's already framed up by the Internal Revenue and Services and the whole nonprofit 501c3 tax code? So maybe, can we hear your thoughts on this next, Jerome?
Yeah, no, I think as I was listening to Minsun, it just, like just being in the practice as Minsun is, I think he's framed up the capital issue. And I mean, I think, first I want to say, I think there's, great and wonderful work that's going on the ground in terms of cooperative. And it feels like the moment that we're in is like, so beautiful. I remember, like a decade or more ago, like, wanting to do this work. And I was in like, a rural area down south. And it was just like a little bit harder. People didn't know what you were talking about and that sort of thing. And so being in this moment where sort of the cooperative, the language, and it's much more spread and much more dispersed, and like many more examples and many more things to link into are sort of part of the context we're in. And I think this is just sort of trying to find a way to complement what what the community has already been building, and continue to sort of expand who gets to participate in it. Because that was often a sort of question for me, is like who sort of has access to this, and like, and what kind of supports do they need to move into this, given both the capital problem to giving the sort of technical assistance, because cooperatives need support, and given that we might want to reduce some of their expenses. And so for me, it was like trying to figure out like where is that sort of good place. Again, as you noted, sort of every state could be doing something different, and some states doing nothing at all. And so how can we sort of include in the states where they weren't doing anything at all, these people who are trying to do these like projects on the ground, right? And so so that's sort of how I sort of approached the question, and sort of thought of,
Well, I guess to put a finer point on it, because you went right to where the real heart of my question was, which is, does it seem like an overbearing and complicated thing to go right for the federal change? Or does it seem like that there might be enough of a compelling case, reasonable data, political will to just go right in and say, this is a minor change. These are people who are already doing social enterprises. I mean, however we frame it, right? People who are already engaged in this, and one piece I didn't want to lose, that I actually dropped from something that you had said earlier, Minsun, is it's not just the tax savings, it's also the procurement. Like the thing that you're saying of there's already mountains of policy that frames up who socially should be supported and included for certain reasons, but also just a whole framework for nonprofits generally. So I think that's the beauty in what I'm hearing from you, and what's inspiring me about I'm now hearing this for the second or third time, Jerome, from you, that like there's already this huge framework. And the scale of this, nonprofits, we're talking about like $1 trillion industry in the United States, thinking about it as an industry, that being able to tap into that instead of having to go through and pass and codify all kinds of different policies, even for procurement, let alone taxes and everything else, donations, asset holding, like it unlocks a lot of things and then hitches it into cooperative models and ownership. So that's part of my question, is like, does it seem like maybe we focus and can get something done federally, or does that seem is that too idealistic of me?
For me, I think that at some point, I think it has to be federal. I mean, that's the kind of the
Well, at some
ultimate.
point, obviously.
Yeah, right. But I think right now, for example, in Colorado, we are just working with the city councils actually to create a preferential procurement policy for our worker cooperatives. So then they will always ask why, right? Because why do I need to give you this preferential procurement? But wouldn't that be so nice if actually say, hey, we are social cooperative, and then assuming that they know what that means, that, oh, you are coming from the marginalized community, and then you are actually, then, if we have that kind of categorizations of social cooperative will connect directly to preferential procurement. That's how I say, right? Because hey, I got the certification from U.S. Federation Worker Co-op. Not that like they know, they take care of it. But, again, any kind of certification process will actually say, hey, we don't have to explain what is a social cooperative, right? Because that has a clear definition that we serve the marginalized community, period. Then we should actually get a more preferential procurement. That is actually what's happening in South Korea. All the social procurement has to go to those social cooperative first. There is a budget that each department has to meet. And that's when actually the power can, get bigger. We are not there yet, but again, some point we have to start what is a social cooperative and how we're going to actually certify them. If we actually it doesn't happen at the city level or state level or whole federal level, I think we need some sort of our own self certification process. And I really agree with you, Esteban, that you know what, this has to be actually grassroots organizing effort. You know what, we claim ourselves, say, hey, we are part of it, so that we'll keep pushing the city councils and the state officials to think about it, and so that they could start giving more preferential procurement, for social cooperatives. And I think that's where the beauty is and the power comes, because they can actually get that government support, which is needed to lift these people out of poverty and out of all those marginalized conditions.
If you look into the chat, you'll see Tamina just posted our survey that we would love to have your feedback about this webinar. Do it now while it's fresh in your mind. Only takes a minute. It really helps us think about the content that we're offering and how we can improve. So we really appreciate you for clicking that link. Give us some feedback on this webinar. Couple other things as we close. First of all, just a huge thank you to our presenters today and to Esteban for leading the discussion as well. I think I definitely learned a lot. I've worked in a lot of nonprofits and I learned things I never knew about nonprofit structure today, and as well to have the benefit of the research and thinking that you've both been doing was just really, really wonderful. So huge thanks to our presenters today. Definitely check out their work. And I wanted to also mention there are a couple of upcoming events you could see on your screen from the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. You can always find lots and lots of events if you go to our website, usworker.coop/calendar.
That's it. Oh, yeah.
Well, I was going to bring them like straight to the events. In particular, tomorrow we have office hours on union co-ops. So if you have a particular question about union co-ops, how to start one, what they are, what to do with the one you already have, feel free to bring those by. That's something that we're having tomorrow, and you can see the other stuff coming up that we welcome you to sign up for as well. And with that, I believe we are complete. So thanks again once again to everyone for being here today. It was great to be with you, and we hope to see you again.